Think back to the last history class that you can remember. Think about the last history lesson that you really enjoyed, that you found yourself really enamored with. I want you to think about why you liked that lesson so much. Maybe it was a great teacher who felt like they really wanted you to know the topic. Maybe it was because you found yourself making connections and asking questions about other bits of history. Regardless, I'm willing to bet a lot of you watching this weren't enthralled by the history itself, but rather something about the environment surrounding it. Interactivity and responsiveness is great for education. It's why we have teachers in classrooms, rather than just textbooks. It's why exams are so valuable as a tool to measure our progress. It's why people say you can't really start learning how to drive until you actually get behind the wheel and start moving. History lessons aren't about all the ways in which we can do something to make other things happen. The subjects of the lessons have already transpired. They're set in stone. The task of making history interesting and approachable often falls to outside factors. Games might seem like an obvious opportunity to add some of this much-needed interactivity to the learning of new subjects. It's no surprise that as computers began to develop, people started making educational video games right away. It just so happens that games are really great at giving players a sandbox of tools, ideas, and possibilities, and just letting them see what happens when they put things together. Games about history exist, sure, but these games usually aren't interested in exploring some deeper historical idea or teaching their players in the same way that games about science or engineering do. These games are meant for people who likely already know the historical details and context about the time period they're recreating, and they're only interested in some historical set dressing. Allow me to present John Company 2nd Edition. Released to store shelves in 2022 by brothers Cole and Drew Worley, John Company is a competitive strategy game centered around the British East India Company, set over a period of around 150 years. In the game, 1 to 6 players each take control over a powerful, influential family owning shares in or working for the company. John Company is a thrilling, well-balanced economic game about negotiation, in which players need to make deals and convince each other to make actions that would benefit one or both parties involved. Unlike other similar economic games like Brass, Agricola, or Puerto Rico, players aren't necessarily operating independently of each other. Rather, they're bound together into this big forced cooperative goal to run the East India Company well and to turn a profit, while also trying to squeeze more out of it for their own family's reputation than the other players. This reputation is tracked here in the top left of the board in the form of victory points, earned through a variety of means, but most commonly, retiring old family members to fancy renowned estates and owning shares in the company, assuming it's successful. Owning a lot of money at the end of the game is not valuable, but both shares and estates cost money, so players are always trying to ride that risk-reward line of making as much money as they can and hoping that they're able to spend it. Here's an example of a situation that could happen during play. Let's say you're president of Bengal, and you want to do a lot of trading this turn. Trading will net your family a fraction of the profit as a reward, and you're looking to retire your president after this turn. To do this, you need funding directed to your office, so you turn to the chairman, who's responsible for distributing the company balance at each turn. The chairman, however, is upset with you for something that you did last round, and vows to only give funding to the president of Madras. However, he neglected to consider that you were also director of trade, and now you threaten to move the ships, which are vital to trade, north to Bengal, leaving him no choice but to fund you if he wants the company to turn a profit this round. It's tense interactions like these that John Company is really all about. You're forced to work together just enough to keep the companies afloat, sure, but ultimately this is a game about ambitious families attempting to use the British East India Company for personal gain. There's always an opportunity to stab your fellow investors in the back, and throughout any given game, tensions and resentment build, and players stop operating completely logically. You are not going to end up running the most efficient, profitable, and successful company together, because on your turn, the opportunity to get back at those who wronged you becomes even more tempting. This game can be frustrating, personal, and provocative. The real resentment that you start to feel towards other players at your table pushes you towards actively sabotaging the company that you're running just to see them fail. It's in this system of betrayal and sabotage that John Company makes its point. The game says on the cover that it's meant as a frank portrait of an institution that was as dysfunctional as it was influential. It's a powerful political satire, contrasting the childish bickering of these influential families with the real historical human impact that the East India Company and British imperialism more generally had on the world. I consider John Company to be an educational game. Unlike the history lessons I mentioned earlier, however, it's not interested in the details of history, but the meaning that they carry. It's possible, in a game of John Company, for things to play out exactly as they did in real life. But that's extremely unlikely. And I think that's a good thing. The game doesn't need you to know all the details of its history, but it wants you to understand their implications. If you once again think back to the history classroom, I'm sure you can remember a time when learning about some terrible dictator, conqueror, or ruler. History's full of them, after all. I'm sure all of us have looked at that and thought to ourselves, damn, that's a bad guy. We wonder how the people of his country could let someone like that stay in charge. We think about the villains that we know from the media we consume. Cruel, violent people like Palpatine or Voldemort. We think to ourselves, well, I can't even imagine killing one person, let alone 20,000. Surely I would do a better job. But I think something that traditional textbooks really fail to convey, even when they try, is who the people behind these terrible regimes truly are and what they're thinking. In 1963, Hannah Arendt published a book titled Eichmann in Jerusalem, a report on the banality of evil, in which she recounted the trial of Adolf Eichmann, an official of the Nazi Party and officer of the Schutzstaffel during the Second World War. In the book, Arendt describes the mannerisms, actions, and reactions of the man as he's questioned about his role in carrying out the Nazis' genocidal final solution. Her thesis is that Eichmann was really not a fanatic or a sociopath, but instead a mundane person who relied on orders, superiors, and the promise of promotion, rather than thinking for himself. Despite all the efforts of the prosecution, everybody could see that this man was not a monster, but it was difficult indeed not to suspect that he was a clown. And since this suspicion would have been fatal to the entire enterprise, and was also rather hard to sustain in view of the sufferings he and his like had caused to millions of people, his worst clowneries were hardly noticed and almost never reported. Arendt's book was, and still is, hugely influential, and has recontextualized many of the ways in which we speak about destructive regimes. John Company communicates this idea of banal evil more effectively than any history lesson that I personally have ever seen. The game doesn't position its players as soldiers or citizens, or really anyone who would be interacting much with Indians. Instead, you play only the managers, the rich families born with the privilege to push order and displace people to suit their own needs while staying completely abstracted from them. And they want prestige. It's this single-minded pursuit of their own goals that made them so terrible. These people didn't actively wish suffering and death upon the natives of the lands that they conquered. They simply didn't even consider them. I highly doubt any of them, if handed a knife, would have been able to bring themselves to kill another person with it, and yet it is through their inability, or worse, their conscious avoidance, to fully comprehend the ramifications of their decisions that they allowed, or directly caused, millions of people to suffer. And now the game has put you in their place. It can be a nasty feeling, and it's something that I expect will turn many players away from their first few games. But I think it's incredibly important to the lesson that John Company is trying to deliver. And I have massive respect to Cole and Drew Worley for taking these themes head on rather than trying to casually ignore them like some other board games have. How ironic would that have been, huh? This I believe, is John Company's greatest strength. Aside from the interesting and perfectly balanced player interaction and gameplay, it's the way that the game's mechanics perfectly reflect the biting satire and critique that its designers believe. This is more than a well-designed, cooperative, competitive company management game. John Company is steeped in the history that it's built around.
This is just a game, after all. And yet, aside from some artistic design choices, you're looking at what the real families of the company looked at. The game board is not a model for a human conflict or a burgeoning settlement. This map is a model for a map. You aren't supposed to imagine waves of armies clashing. You're playing as politicians, aristocrats, and businessmen sitting around a table. It's a game to you, just as it was a game to them, shifting people's lives in a great calculus of power. The only abstraction that the game provides you is time. You couldn't have a board game take 150 years. The game does not make you plan exact troop movements or trade routes, not because it would make the game too complicated, but because the people you're playing wouldn't be responsible for those decisions. You play the machine. Your job is to take in people, process and organize them into whatever roles will reward you the most money and power, and when they retire, you replace them with another. There's no grandeur in your work. There's no heroic battles to be clutched from the jaws of defeat, only budgets to be allocated. Things play out more or less as you expect, and if only all the other families would just do what you wanted them to do, things could go so well. In the conclusion to the rulebook, Cole makes this design philosophy explicit. There are many games about empires. In most, their existence and their internal coherence is taken for granted. This makes for clean design, but very bad history. No empire springs into being fully formed. Their genealogies are as messy as their modes of operation. John Company embraces this complexity and attempts to tell just one small part of the origin story of the British Empire.